Our last speaker for today is NayanTara Gurung Kakshapati, who lives in Kathmandu, Nepal, and works at the intersections of visual storytelling, research, pedagogy, and collective action. In 2007, she co-founded Photo Circle, a platform that facilitates learning, exhibition making, and publishing opportunities for Nepali photographers that is working in increasingly transdisciplinary ways. I recall receiving the Photo Circle newsletters in my inbox for quite a while before having met NayanTara and knowing what a force she is, thinking, who is behind this thing? So it's been great to actually get to know her in the last 2 years or so and have her with us today. She's also co-founded Nepal Picture Library in 2011, a digital archiving initiative that works towards diversifying Nepali social and cultural history by centering the histories of women, Dalit, Madhesi, indigenous and queer people. NayanTara is also the co-founder and festival director of Photo Kathmandu, an international festival that takes place in Kathmandu every 2 years. And she will be speaking through some of these models and her current commitments through them.
Thank you. I'm glad our newsletter was badgering you before we actually met. Thank you for having me here, Priyanka, Pratik. I had heard a lot about the hub, and then last year, for the first time, I was at the art fair and saw your booth, and understood Experimenter's role as a gallery. But being here and seeing this, really I think gives me really expanded understanding of even the role of a gallery in the ecology that we work in and inhabit. So great to be here. I'm going to try to present sort of 3 pieces of this, the work that we've been doing in the last 12 years or so now. Photo Circle. So, I mean, it's always a bit of a struggle to describe what Photo Circle is. We work as a collective, but we're not really a collective. We run a lot of workshops and learning initiatives, but we're not a school. We work like an agency in the sense we represent photographers and help them to actually put their work out into the market, but we're not an agency. So our role really sort of morphs and responds to the needs of the community and the interests of the community as well. We try to support in a conscious way the making of images, and we try to also work with the image makers in distribution of those images in various forms. So we publish, but we're not publishers. We make exhibitions, but we're not a gallery, or a museum. So I think a lot of what has happened in the last couple of years is a lot of our work has gone into the thinking around and through images as well, through a cross-section of programming that we do. A lot of our work is shaped by, a certain set of commitments that we really try to sort of work with. And one is really the commitment to the public, because we really feel like a huge part of our work has been about creating community. And I don't mean that just in terms of a professional community or an artistic community, but really, or an intellectual community, but really sort of bridging our work and the work that our community does with a much larger Nepali public. And our work is also shaped by our sort of commitment towards the archive and to looking back and looking at history and sort of connecting that with looking forward, and to creating ways for some of this intergenerational knowledge sharing to happen in our own communities. And our work is also influenced, I think, largely by, yes, definitely the need to critique and resist, but also to build and to be generative, because in many ways we're starting from scratch. And we were just, a little chat earlier, sort of, I often find myself and the work that we do on the periphery of most communities that we work with. We're not in the middle of the mainstream art, community. We're not in mainstream media. We're not in mainstream education. So it's really functioning at the peripheries of all of this, but really thinking about what that allows us to do. And one thing that does allow us is a great deal of independence and sort of, and earlier this had come up, right? Freedom, but also in the context of what? Like what kind of a freedom? But it does allow us to do many things and be many things and say many things that are perhaps more difficult to do when you're at the center. So I think we've been thinking about that more consciously in the last couple of years and learning how to actually use that as a strategy in our work and see that actually perhaps as an opportunity and a strength, like you were just saying too, Tarun, as opposed to really sort of, a disadvantage, and really also turning our own sort of our own understanding of where we are at in Nepal as beyond just a story of lack, because when we started out, it was really about, oh, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the spaces, but really sort of saying, how can we work within all of that with what we have and what we are able to generate for ourselves. So I will start off with this project because, so like I said, we started out in 2007, and for me, it's been a lot of sort of logistics and fundraising and admin and the grunt of it. And so I was really sort of hungry for more generative opportunities and sort of deep dives and more creative sort of possibilities even for myself. And so the Feminist Memory Project came about as an opportunity to do that with a close friend who is the co-curator of this project, Diwas Rajakesi. Diwas has a background in history, and he is a trained film editor as well. And so we set out on this sort of, it's been quite an adventure and an ongoing one, really as an effort to sort of build a dedicated archive for the histories of, and I say histories because we really do see this as a plurality of the various women's and feminist movements in Nepal, and really focusing on the relationship between visibility, memory, and history. So really trying to sort of flesh these things out. We really believe that, to become public is to be seen, and therefore to be sort of accounted for in history. And so the journey of Nepali women from within the boundaries of the domestic sphere to the openness of public life is really a move from obscurity to memory. It rides on the feminist impulse to memorialize women's pasts, and in the belief that their historical visibility will advance the case for liberation. So in the process, we've really in the very initial research phase was only about 5 months, and we had a team of 4 researchers led by Diwas. And as we fanned out sort of in an effort to try to source material and identify people to source from, we really realized that many, many, many women in the last 5, 6, 7 decades had been archiving and memorializing in their own way. And so it was really sort of also beginning to network those archives that were literally in shoeboxes and under people's beds and in closets tucked away. So the images that we were able to uncover through the Feminist Memory Project illustrate narratives from the past when women have really taken on political struggles, addressed assemblies, paved new paths through education, published and shaped opinion, traveled and described the world, and become figures of authority, and have broken social norms in so many, many ways. And these images really show us, I think, a view of how publicness itself has emerged as a key feminist strategy in Nepal. And I think the visual has this remarkable, evidentiary potential, and so really um, a visual archive really being really important evidence, in a way to prove, because there is this great need to prove uh, the role and the participation of women in history, apparently. Right? So the visual allows us to see with our eyes and sort of therefore believe, and so we were trying to sort of see if we can actually make people believe. The archive also, a visual archive, we found in, a socio-political and cultural context like ours in Nepal, does have the possibility to enter people's sort of imagination of the past and therefore their present um, in powerful ways. And we've found that efforts to locate women in Nepali history, thus far has really been limited to celebrating successes, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's very important to do, but we really wanted to move away from just the mere sort of canonization that kind of work often is limited to, and we also really wanted to try to move away from mere representation. Right? So we felt, the need to really try to index the lives of Nepali women in ways where, that really pointed to what they were doing, so really looking at that agency. And also, the doing involved many things, like the earlier image at the rally was one of the first sort of public turnouts. And I should go to that image. And this was 1981, and there had been an incident where two young girls had been raped, and the various organizations within various political parties had called for, a coming together and a protest, and there were several rallies and protests like this around the country. 1981, you're organizing without social media. These were questions that we had. How did these women do it? And what's happened now if we sort of call for a protest? Are we going to see this kind of a turnout if we are protesting sexual violence, for example, on the streets today? So looking back has really allowed for some of these questions to come up, and really for us to open some of these conversations with these older women who were part of these movements, who were very much shaping these movements. And we often talk about gaps in intergenerational exchange, but how to really address these gaps, right? Like, what kind of conversations are possible? What kind of spaces do we have to have these conversations? So I do want to share this particular story, and I'll just deep dive into this one, and then there's a lot of content, so I cannot go over everything. But these are ID photos, like taken for citizenship purposes, I think, cards, of a group of women, and these were taken in 1979 in the far western part of Nepal, in Dang. And in 1979, there was this very important peasant revolt that was led by women that had taken place. And all of this had completely vanished from our memory. And it was really sort of this excavation of that history that allowed for one of our researchers, Nisha Rai, to go there back to Dang and to meet 13 of the women who had been part of that movement. The revolt had actually led to land reforms back then in the late 70s and the early 80s, and so these women had really sort of played this very crucial role in that land reform process. I do want to take their names because a lot of our work is about naming people and visibilizing them. And so here, out of the 13, you can see with us today Kewala Chaudhary, Pathar Kali Chaudhary, Shanti Chaudhary, Soma Kumari Chaudhary, Ashma Chaudhary, Indira Chaudhary, Nanachi Chaudhary, Prem Kumari Chaudhary, Sita Chaudhary, Maya Kumari Chaudhary, Ram Krishni Chaudhary, Bel Keshari Chaudhary, and Suraj Kali Chaudhary. The Chaudhary is a ethnic group, an indigenous group, and so they are all Tharu women, and so of one indigenous group. So these are the kinds of slow excavations that the project has allowed us to do, and I mean, yesterday and today too, this has come up a lot. Really, this sort of the binary of the aesthetic and the political, right? And I don't know, for us, we feel these are incredibly aesthetic, but also incredibly political. So I totally agree with everybody else who was making a case for that non-binary. So just to quickly show you also how then we moved very quickly from this 5-month research period to then actually putting the work out, because we wanted to show it quite immediately, because for us archiving really is that sort of dialogic process, and the quick turnaround of activating an archive actually allows us, we feel, to further build the archive. And so this is for sure for us an ongoing project. And so the first iteration of the exhibition took place at Photo Kathmandu last year. It was very much sort of in the public sphere. And now for the second phase of the research, I think we found that people have really responded to that actual exhibition, because they can finally sort of, an idea just goes into something more tangible, and so they're responding to that. So these are just some quick images from the festival. We would like to publish this material, so we're working on a series of publications. This is a project we did 2 years ago, where we are looking at sort of the Dalit and the caste experience in Nepal. And so we'd like to put out a nice book like this, but we're also really thinking, well, where's this book going to go, really? We want to reach people who can't afford this. I mean, this book is highly subsidized in terms of what it costs to produce. So we sell it for like 1,000 rupees, but even 1,000 rupees is expensive, right? I mean, who's going to buy this 1,000 rupee book in Kathmandu and in Nepal? So we're really thinking about different ways of also publishing. The last set of publications we did all cost 200 rupees, and we put it out into the market, really trying to see what kinds of audiences we can reach. A lot of grunt work goes into all of this, like as you all know, and it's not all sexy, and it's a lot of labor. And so really it is the dedication of these teams to really sort of do the slow grind. But that slow grind has really allowed for things like this to happen. So I just wanted to share with you, I think one of the things I feel like has been most productive from this process has been this database that we've been able to create. And you can see, so for this initial phase of the research, we collected material from 107 sources, and those included individuals, but also institutions. Like G-Font is a labor union, and Mangla Devi Singh is a very prominent political figure. And Binda Pandey is currently a member of parliament, but she's been in politics for over 3 decades. So, just to give you a sense of sort of the database that is being created, and really to think about possibilities of engaging then with such databases and with such sort of, processes of building relationships with each of these people, because I think for us that's been really a key part of this. And so now when we build on this project for the next phase of research, we have 107 sources already who can help us snowball this and send us spinning into many, many different directions, I'm sure. So this is just to give you a sense of that. Jumping quickly now to this, because I think for us, a lot of our work, the way we've been thinking about it is that, we're a small team. There are only so many hours in the day, although some people really know how to defy that somehow. um, we've been trying to think about how to connect the dots a lot, and how to make sense of our work as a cumulative sort of impact. And so how to go from one project to another without feeling completely, whacked in the head. And so this opportunity came along. It was actually um, an invitation of sorts, or a prompt of sorts, by the artist Amar Kanwar, who many of you probably know and know his work. I will speak about his work a little later in the context of the festival. But he basically invited us to respond to something that he's been working on through his last body of work, which is a film. And he initiated something that he calls the Curriculum of Studies into Darkness. And, essentially, this invitation for me personally became a really special way to start a collaboration with a dear friend of mine who is a therapist, Prathma Raghavan, who is from India but lives in Nepal. And Prathma works a lot as a disability support professional, and also as a school counselor at the moment. And her work is really as a therapist, really about sort of repair, right, and to rebuild. And so, when this invitation came along, so Amar's work, talks a lot about ways of recomprehending the difficult times that we are living in politically and in many other ways. And he asks these questions: what is it that lies beyond when all arguments are done with, and how to reconfigure and respond again? And for us, we've just been working on the Feminist Memory Project through 2018. And this invitation really became an opportunity to think through some of the processes of that. Because, like I said, we were going to all these women and these organizations and saying, what were the challenges for you guys in terms of coming together, in terms of your movements, in terms of building these intersectional bridges, what were the real challenges? Because often we don't talk about it so much. Movements fall apart, institutions fall apart, solidarities fall apart. And so for us, it became an opportunity to try to understand the imperfection in also solidarity building work. And so many things play a role in all of this. Like, why was there a fight? Why did this NGO kind of suddenly die? You guys were doing amazing work. Oh, funding became an issue. Interpersonal relationships are tough. Egos, leadership, all sorts of issues, real things that happen to real people like all of us. And so really trying to understand some of these challenges and then create space to talk about them, because it's often we either point fingers, and then it becomes like this big public fight between two public figures, or it becomes like institutions that don't speak to each other, etc. So where's the space for us to actually try to negotiate some of this and try to actually build some bridges, especially in a small community like Nepal, right? So if we're constantly just going to sort of have these fractures and not address them, then where do we go from there? And so this project really became an opportunity for us to organize, for the lack of a better word. We've been calling them seminars. We're also calling them explorations, because they're very exploratory in nature. And we've been working across themes, themes that interest us. But the gatherings really are based on a couple of key things. One is to take the time to sit and talk, because in our busy lives, it's so, we meet for like a panel discussion here or a workshop there, and we can't really talk. So I actually, this gathering and this taking of time is so valuable in that, and I really appreciate you guys sort of making that a concerted effort, because a lot can come out of it. Two, it's also been sort of the nature of the groups. So they've been really mixed groups. Some of them are artists, but most of them are not. They're activists, lawyers, therapists, people working in various NGOs and on various issues. So it's journalists, and some of them are there in personal capacities. Others are there in institutional sort of capacities. We've decided to do this whole thing without taking any funding, because for us that is another key thing, because funding can shape so many interests and conversations. So it's been a very clear strategy not to do that. In fact, we all sort of pitch in 500 each day for lunch that day or whatever, So, and those who can't won't, and that's fine too. So it's been this sort of open framework that we've been trying to create. And a lot of the thinking around this framework has been influenced and inspired by some really critical work that is being done by direct action activist Vicki Reynolds and her larger community, and this practice which has for a long time remained within the world of psychotherapy, which is called narrative practices, is now sort of spilling over, and many storytellers and artists are also working this. How do we narrativize our lives, whether it's in the context of, an art project or in the context of a healing project, right, and therapy and moving forward. So Pratma has been my sort of gateway to this knowledge and this thinking, and so we've been working through all of this. Just to give you like a very quick sense of what some of the content has been. So it's been really ranging from, this was an exploration we did that we call Learning from the Natural World, and this book by Peter Wolleben, who is this German forester, and he's been writing about ecological themes in what we call popular language, right? So it's beautiful thinking around the way a forest works together, like social security when it comes to the relationship of trees and forests, and this idea of burnout and this idea of like etiquette, and how all of that is actually in a forest system presented to us in this incredible book that he's written. And then we also were working with this podcast of where Wangari Maathai, who many of you I'm sure know, is a Kenyan environmentalist activist and the first African woman to have received a Nobel Prize. And so, building curriculum for us has been part of this framework, and so it's really using material that is found online, most of the time open source, and sometimes material that the group has access to in different ways, that we're bringing together to build curriculum. This day was followed by this day, and it was a real actually rough transition of like being in nature and thinking about how we love our ecology and we want to preserve our forests, to then really this stark conversation around, well, who are these forests being preserved for, and what about the deprivation and the deep sort of injustice that is happening around ecological work also. Like in Nepal, we've had a lot of problems around the work of protecting our national parks, and lots of international funding has actually shaped discourse in very specific ways. And so it's really difficult within even that sector to talk about these two, what are considered to be two sides of a coin almost, but what if we are people who care about the forests, but who also care about the people who used to live in them? I mean, it's like, how do you navigate then that? Is there no room for any conversation around that? This idea of single stories and stereotypes is really sort of has shaped this framework and the conversations that happen there. And so this is just to give you an idea of an exercise that we had for that session. So we're imagining these four characters, right? An indigenous male member of a buffer zone committee involved in poaching, an indigenous woman running a homestay there successfully, a business, a young female US educated conservationist who is also a WWF employee, and a young male local indigenous political activist. And really thinking through the intersections of all these identities and the challenge of these people in working together or working with these issues, etc. And so here you see a set of sort of questions or prompts that we issue, to the group, and it's a lot of talking all day long. We felt a bit guilty, I must say, about sitting in a room, yet another room, sitting down, talking, and what are we doing, So this real sort of balance we try to strike between like the thinking and the doing, and the thinking that should inform the doing, and the doing that should inform the thinking or the making, etc. So really trying to sort of find, I don't know, like a flow through which to work through these processes. Sexual violence has been something that we have been thinking a lot about, sexual harassment in our own communities as well, whether they are professional communities or whether they are within our own, communities of friendships or families also. And so really thinking through some of these issues in this framework, right, has been difficult for sure, very difficult. But I think, I don't know, I do feel in the last 1 year, I do feel we're making a little bit of progress. So really thinking about ideas around shame and stigma and, vulnerability, because we do need to humanize all of this, right? We do need to think of survivors as human beings and of also harm doers as human beings. And that's what Pratma really brings to the table, I think, as being a therapist, really thinking about repair. How do we move on? Especially in this sort of post-Me Too, I don't know, are we post? Are we still in Me Too mode? But really thinking about repair also as something, not in order to brush off incidents and in an effort to not talk about accountability and justice and all of this, but really to say, how do we move forward? How do we move beyond just the call-out culture or the cancel culture that many of us do have to deal with in our own communities? And so that has been a theme. We set up an Instagram feed to put some of this material out, because for each seminar we read a lot, we listen to a lot of material, and so we just wanted to share this and to have it be an open thing. So there's this Instagram thing, there's also this Google Doc as an open source resource, document, platform, whatever, that we put stuff on. So you're all welcome to go to these feeds. The festival. Do we have time? 5 minutes? Okay. So there's a video, and maybe I'll just show you the video and not do a lot of talking. Or actually, to end with, I'll just quickly maybe, let's save the video for the end. If you could just quickly, I'll show you the video, but maybe that'll like wake you up at the end. And I'll just quickly ramble for like 2 minutes before that. So the festival started in 2015. It was a difficult year, 2015, because I'm sure you all know we had that crazy earthquake, right? And so we were in the midst of planning the festival already, and the earthquake hit, and we were like, we're crazy planning a photo festival, post-earthquake. So we dumped the festival and we like jumped into all this relief work like everybody else then did. But about 5 months into it, we really felt like even for ourselves, we needed something a little bit hopeful to work on and something like constructive to work on. So we said, okay, let's do this crazy festival. And it was also a time where a certain friendly neighbor of ours had imposed a blockade. And so we were working. We were working in very dire constraints. Zero fuel. We were going around buying fuel for like 500% of the price. Like 2 liters here, 4 liters there. We need to deliver some invitations tomorrow. So for the first year of the festival, we decided to show work only made in and on Nepal. And so we were showing really Nepali photographers like Kishore Sharma and Prasid Stapit. But we were also showing work that was made on Nepal by photographers like Philip Blenkinsop and Kevin Bobrisky, who'd been working in Nepal for over 30, 40 years, some of them, but whose work we in Nepal had never seen, because this work always travels like all around the world, but never really comes home. And so this became a way for us to be able to do that for the first year. We felt also, because this is a very public festival, that it was sort of the only way we could think of interfacing to begin with. We wanted to have the Nepali public sort of respond to this work that we were putting out in a very immediate way, because it was also that very difficult year. And so we did not want to touch the earthquake or any topics around natural disasters, but we wanted to look back, and we wanted to kind of look at how we'd lived for this long, and so kind of use that also as a way to look forward. The second year of the festival, we tried to take a step forward. Visual language is something we think a lot about. We just sticking an exhibition out on the street is not necessarily going to make it accessible. And so what kind of a visual language are we sort of speaking through? We were taking decisions like, there was one work by Tasneem Al Sultan. And for the Nepali public, Saudi, as it's fondly referred to, we have a very specific relationship to Saudi, right? Thousands of Nepali migrant laborers go to Saudi to work every day. And so the political imagination of Saudi for a Nepali audience is very specific. But Tasneem's work was like really interesting, because it showed this particular class of Saudi women and the lives they lived and the struggles that they faced that were very similar to what struggles women in Nepal faced. And so it was a really interesting, I think, conversation, and an opening up of a conversation that happened. So we've been trying to take decisions, sort of curatorial decisions in that way. For us, creating engagement around the work we show is really, really important. So the lightning testimonies, again by Amar Kanwar, that I referred to earlier, we invited Amar to show this work as part of Photo Kathmandu last year, 2018. And one of the things we both agreed on, which was like a real good deal breaker, was that it made no sense to try to show this work for a short duration. So we agreed on 6 months. And I had absolutely no idea how we were going to pull it off, because we had no venue, no space. And so we were, after a lot of hunting, given at no cost the top floor of this new mall that was being constructed in Thamel, which is like the tourist district in Kathmandu. And we were like, free space? Okay, we'll take it. And so we really constructed, the housing or the shell for this incredibly powerful work. I'm not going to talk about the work. I'm sure many of you know it intimately. It is incredibly powerful and a real sort of something that lives in you for a long, long time. And so, there was a whole production sort of circus that was involved, and but we were really able to sort of bring in Amar's team and Amar himself and really build this from scratch, literally. And so it became this extremely important platform for us for 6 months, throughout which we ran a lot of local programming. So we did do, the upstairs housed the work, and the downstairs, so it was 2 floors, we began to install this sort of local response to the work, and so really to create an archive locally of the way sexual violence had been depicted, documented, and the kinds of knowledge production that has happened around the work. We did a lot of public programming. We offered guided tours, so this is a huge part of our work. We train young facilitators to really work with groups who want to come engage with the work. So, and these are young people who are in college or who are like studying engineering or whatever. Using ways. So this letter writing exercise became really exciting for many visitors. We would ask people to think of somebody who was dear to them and write them a letter after they sort of viewed the work and experienced the work, and a lot of like incredible letters. Lots of people took their letters home with them, but some of them left them behind. And you know, the kind of reflection and the kind of like taking of time to impact people as people, young people, children, responding to the work as well. I won't get into the letters because you know there's no time, but this one comment I can't read from here. Why did this happen to me, you, them? I can't read the last word, but that was all somebody left there, this note, you know. And me, you, him, them. Okay. So really, really, you know, the kinds of reflections that we want to create around this issue. This is a letter that this mother wrote to her son, and a really powerful one where she's basically talking about how glad she was that she didn't bring him to the exhibition that day, because he would have been, it was like too early to expose him to the horrors of this violence. But at the same time, how sad she was that he didn't come, because then how are, you know, young men supposed to sort of experience this and think through this, etc. We were working a lot with law students because we really feel the need to talk about justice and the limitations of legal frameworks when we're talking about sexual violence and sexual harassment. So really, you know, trying to think beyond the formal justice system, and to think of alternative ways, and to think of transformative justice as well, within the scope of this conversation. Workshops for teachers, how teachers, history teachers, social studies teachers might engage with a work like this and include it into curricula planning. Workshops for mental health professionals, how they might engage with works like this and include it into their practices. Then it also became somehow this like weekly meeting venue for the Me Too Nepal meetings. That there were some stories that broke in the media, you know, right then, and there was a particular case in the theater community in Kathmandu, and so we just, it was very sort of organic. We just started like having these meetings there, and that space somehow just became like this dark room to have these meetings in. But it was like incredible. People were responding, you know, to of course the work, but really to much more, you know, and the relationship of the work with the outside world, and vice versa. And that is what that space has become now as of 1 week ago. So yeah, we, you know, we made a conscious decision not to invest in a space 10 years ago, and we've stuck to that because we've put in whatever resources we can into actual, like, developing human resources and other things. But a space does allow for many things to happen. But for the time being, we occupy spaces around the city and in different places. It gets built up and then broken down, etc. And I suppose the cycle shall continue.
You're welcome to occupy this minute.
Oh.
Great. So much was said. I'm just trying to think where to start. Because I do have a question about Photo Kathmandu, and for that it might be helpful to go a little bit into the video, but I'll ask you two questions and then we can see how everybody else also is responding. So just about the format of imperfect solidarities, if you could just share a little bit more about how you imagine taking it forward, because of course the kind of informality of it, the alliance building, I know that it is also for you a way to work with the current generation of sort of peers as well, in a sense, across borders. So you had Aziz, Sohail, no,
Yeah.
and others who you have recently also met, practitioners who of this generation who are sort of trying to be very realistic about these imperfections in alliance building. But at the same time, beyond having kind of open format, digital sharing, etc., is it a platform that you are committed to have located in Kathmandu, or are you imagining it as something that can travel or open up in different ways? If you could just share.
Sure. It's an idea and a format, so it can go anywhere really, right? But I do think that it works only if the community sort of takes ownership of that, and I don't know where I can go where I have that same those relationships, you know. I feel I can only do it in my community, but other people are really welcome to, you know, take that and run with it. Prathma and I are based in Kathmandu, and we've just actually, since putting that Instagram page up, we received some invitations, like on that Instagram, like on message. It's like there's a conference happening in Bangkok. You know, would you like to come facilitate some sessions, etc. For us, that's not really what it's about. You know, for us, it's about sort of really keeping it grounded where we are located, because again, like I said, that's where we feel we can feed into, you know, whatever issues. But it's an idea and can go anywhere really. So.
Could you talk a little bit more also about, I mean, the question of sexual violence is also just something that um, all of a lot of people are concerned about, and it's something that needs careful, conscious framing, and at the same time, situations in which discussions can be held. And like, what was interesting is that you were trying to do various kinds of discussions. Some are more spontaneous, others are planned,
Yeah.
and rethinking about different measures of justice. If you could also elaborate, because something that I learned from the photo Kathmandu as just a small example of what can be done is that there was a sort of a code of conduct. And what we did for Columboscope in Sri Lanka, which is a festival that I'm working on with a team in Sri Lanka, is to have a festival code of conduct that drew from what NayanTara shared from Photo Kathmandu, and then we specifically sort of also tailored it to our context and different forms of discrimination. So it's not only about sexual violence, it's also about discrimination that can happen, racial and other forms of discrimination within these platforms that we create for culture that we say are inclusive, but then, you know, what are we willing to do, and are we willing to sort of create a code of behavior in which we can sort of also then share generosity but also protect those who are taking part.
Yeah, we made a code of conduct. It was a very simple one. It just said that, you know, we're committed as organizers, as people sort of creating this space, we are committed to trying our best to create a safe space. Now that term is also quite loaded. Like, what does that actually mean? You know, safe for who? Like you said, it's not just about gender. It really is thinking about class and caste and like so many sort of. We even included in the code of conduct that we were not happy about discrimination that happened along like lines of ability or lines of marital status. Uh, but it's true, you know. I mean, these are nuances within every community that we don't necessarily feel we have the space to even talk about. And the kind of, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about, you know. I feel like, you know, I feel very strongly about this, and I come at it quite openly. But I realize that the kinds of economies that we perhaps work within, it's not so easy to talk about it openly, and for various reasons, legitimate reasons perhaps. but also, you know, in a way, this somehow this self-censorship also that, you know, I think we often do in terms of like finding the space or not finding the space, finding the right time, not finding the right time to talk about all of this. It really plays into it. I do want to mention this. So because we've been, you know, dealing with all of this in our own community, we've been thinking about all of this. Something we initiated was there was an incident in the theater community, and this particular group, theater group, had been for the last 4 years working on a production of the Vagina Monologues, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, this work by Eve Ensler. And because for 4 years as a group, they'd been like coming together and really like talking about this for 4 years, they were somehow in a position to, when these incidents, these call-outs happen, they somehow were in a position to say, we would like to address this. We would like to meet with some of these. There were 3 men who were called out with these men. So can we organize some meetings? And they invited a friend of mine and me to kind of like facilitate these meetings in a way, like, you know, I mean, our role was very, I mean, what exactly, how exactly does one facilitate these things? There are no guidebooks for this, no formulas. But we went in nonetheless because we all felt the need to address this in some way. And so these became these like face-to-face meetings where these women sat down and they said to, you know, these men, address them to say, Dai, you know, most Dai is the term for brother, right? What is it here? Bhaiya, Bhai, whatever, older brother. You know, we recognize that we have to continue to live and work in this community. We're not saying you need to like go take a bun bath or something now, right? It's not realistic. We also are very clear that we don't want to go the legal route because there are so many barriers and challenges going that route. But we want to address this. We want you to say sorry, if that's what it takes. You know, we want you to say, this will not happen again. These are men who are constantly in touch with younger theater practitioners, you know, on an ongoing basis. We want as a community to say, this is not okay anymore. Like, we can't just keep brushing this under the carpet, you know. Come together to do this. So we had these crazy meetings that were like some of the most difficult conversations I've had in my life, to try to really talk about this, to create enough of a safe space for these young women to come forward, but also enough of a safe space for these men to feel like they could come and do this, right? It was a very unique circumstance, I think, because of this very particular experience that this very particular theater group had gone through for 4 years, and all of this had happened. So, you know, there are so many variables, and you can't just like pick that experience up and take it to another one. But it happened, and it taught, I think, us a lot along the way. And it's an ongoing process too. It's not like it's done now, right? So this idea of accountability is like a long-term idea. Based out of that experience, what we've done is 3 arts organizations now, including ourselves, Photo Kathmandu, the Kathmandu Triennale, which is like also happening next year, and Film South Asia, which is a film festival that happens every 2 years. We have come together and we are pitching in, so splitting it 3 ways: legal costs, any other kinds of resources that need to be put into the creation of a policy for ourselves, our institutions, and also a framework. You know, I mean, here in India, you have laws that allow for ICCs. In Nepal, we don't have that by law also. There are, within labor laws and within workplace harassment sort of frameworks, possibilities for complaint handling mechanisms to be instituted. But what we're trying to do is come together, and again, extremely difficult process, but to imagine a potential mechanism that goes beyond just compliance of the law, and to really think about what's it going to take for us to be able to address this as institutions. as a community. So we're working on this policy. It's going to take some time, I think, but that might become like my most substantial creative output for this year. So.
Great. So just one last question from me before we open up. Just also if you could just share concretely some of the processes and formats that are included in Photo Kathmandu to also make it accessible not only to the kind of city audience and tourist audience of Kathmandu, but also going beyond. I mean, you're talking already about the communities that dwell on the land and the forest and all of that. So how are you also dealing with those as your audience or your constituencies?
Yeah. It's a tough one. We've tried after the first year to go out on the road. So we had a traveling version of the festival that went out to 4 districts in the first year. The second year, we couldn't raise the funds for it. It's a realistic challenge. But what we did end up doing was we partnered with friends who run a project that has a traveling literary, it's actually called the Book Bus and is supported by the US Embassy. And it goes around the country running literacy programs in different places. So we created like this really easy to travel version of 3 exhibitions, and that went out through that program around the country. But it's tough. This time, because we are working on a few things for next year, that will sort of really engage with communities outside the city. We are planning for more engagement, but for us the festival is more than just the exhibition program, right? So it's not just about taking exhibitions elsewhere. It's really about working with and creating engagements of various sorts outside the power center, which is Kathmandu. But it's an idea that we, I mean, we put some nice pictures in our report last year to say we do travel, but it's hard. It's really tough. Yeah.
As part of the conversations around the Me Too movement in the US, what we've started doing now is actually also, asking some of these more open men, more openly kind of, friendly to questioning, roping them in as part of the Me Too movement and saying that the movement will not succeed unless we had them as our partners. And that strategy has worked well to give them that sense of responsibility and power, because a lot of the violence tends to be around power, and no, it's around, feeling of powerless.
Here's some more power. No. Would you like to do something with this?
No, I think just finger pointing was okay, but like there was this one guy, black community. He had gotten hold of a whole bunch of other black men. This was somewhere in, I think on the East Coast, and they had all kind of, done this whole me Tarzan kind of a thing, and they would go one by one into a room where there was a girl there, and they would rape her. They would come out, and this one guy, who was part of that queue, actually he went in and discovered that she was mentally retarded. So he decided he couldn't do it, but he, when he came out, he zipped up his pants and said, that kind of stuff. So he also, and now he is the guy who's leading this whole movement towards saying that not all men are in the same way. And see, he opened up different versions of that conversation. And, so it's something to think about when you have these guys sitting in front of you. And whatever works, right?
I disagree. This is not acceptable. The fact that he was standing in a queue waiting for his turn is not acceptable.
Of course.
And if he turns around and says, okay, what, because she was disabled, or and that is the reason, I mean, that's worse. I mean, you give someone the power to do something about a Me Too movement because the person, I mean, I guess the whole thing just sounds completely wrong. I mean,
No, you're right about that.
yeah.
But the thing is, it has happened. This guy
Yeah,
is
but
now leading the movement. And
But-
It's giving him more power. It's still not right.
it's no, you're right. I mean, it is gross, actually. It should be,
It's not worth, yeah.
I think I mean, it's interesting that, you know, this is, I mean, so quickly, so often, right, the conversation is quickly around not all men, or, you know, some of these things. I think those are all conversations that are important and to be had, I think, for today's purpose, and I think for life's purpose. I have been also trying to really wonder, you know, about some of the tangible and practical things we can do in terms of sort of creating space for these nuances, for sure, right? But at the same time, not like constantly feeling like we're stuck having the same conversation over and over and over again. Because it's, I think, quite often easy for, you know, and especially like this is such a quick addressing of this issue, right? We could be talking about this for like, yeah, for days and days and weeks, but yeah, looking really at some of the structural possibilities, given the context that we are
so this
in.
guy has gone back to his own, drug community and started talking about it, about what he went through, and kind of. And it's a TED talk basically. I haven't met him, but it's a TED talk. And he said he went back to the community where, it's in public housing, and started talking to these guys and saying, what's going on here? What we've been doing is this. I mean, you're right that somebody mentioned it. Yes, of course, we should be in jail, but this is another example of something that's happening in parallel in the Me Too conversation, and something I thought I should bring up, because sometimes there is such a huge power gap between the men and the women.
Sure, it's all about the power, right?
So sometimes roping in some folks, just to move the needle,
yeah,
would be something to think about.
all sorts of folks need to step in and step up, I think, and it's not, yeah.
Are there any other questions in the room?
Yeah, the mic.
It's not a question in that way. I just wanted to say that, hearing you, it's interesting that how the role of a curator is, you give the other dimension comes up as how the curator mitigates through all the challenges to find out solutions, where you can actually bring up a much more, add value to things and, bring out something which is much more positive from this existing situation. And I think yesterday also we had camp also talking about it, where there are problems which leads us to a positive role. You don't take it as a problem, but then you don't take it as a barrier, but then you take it as a challenge and you move ahead, find new alternatives beyond it. So I think this is an interesting aspect, and I'm really thankful to the way you've, you came up with the exhibition and the collaterals which happen around it, where the involvement is much more organic, and you have different sections of the society participating within the exhibition. It is no more exhibition within a group of people who are usually who are usually visiting galleries and museums or spaces where things are exhibited. So I think this moving out from to different sections is very interesting.
Just a quick comment on that, actually, sorry, is that in our case, we never moved out, right? They were never, I mean, we didn't have that infrastructure to begin with, so it's, yeah. Sorry.
No questions, just sharing some thoughts that I'm really moved by your attempt to actually have a dialogue with who's called a perpetrator and the victim in a very simple way. And I'm actually really moved that you made that effort, because that's what doesn't happen. Because they're already put in categories where no reconciliation is possible. And I've always thought that even if, if we want to sidestep the state mechanisms, the whole model of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from South Africa is an amazing kind of a healing as well as very traumatic experience but things when they are done face to face, it's completely different where the line is not drawn that you cannot. So reconciliation within the structure of that model, I think I'm quite really it's amazing that you tried to do that. And I think that is the way forward in many cases like that, although we are not able to do that kind of a thing.
It's tough.
Yeah,
it's
it's
really
very,
tough.
very tough.
But a few things. One, it wasn't us who was initiating this process. It was really the young women and the men who chose to participate in this, right? Of course, they do not exist in isolation. So there are communities around these young women and these men, you know, and the role that these communities play was really key, I think, in terms of support, but also in terms of really calling for accountability, you know, because I think truth for sure is a big goal to establish, to acknowledge that this is happening. You know, we all know this is happening. But reconciliation is a tricky word because not everybody wants to reconcile necessarily. So the idea of accountability actually is really key to this. What forms of accountability? I think we've really been trying to think through, and I think different survivors have opted for different kinds of accountability. In one of the theater examples I took, one of the theater companies who one of these men is associated to actually put out a statement to say that we recognize this, we take responsibility of our role in this, you know, not for his actions, but our stake in this. And we put certain things in measure, you know, like he was put on probation for 1 year from all teaching positions. There were very specific things that were put into place. He did put out an apology, which was public. The theater company offered for 10 sessions of counseling for him. So really, again, really thinking about this as repair work also for everyone involved, you know. So yeah, there were strong sort of consequences for sure. It wasn't just about, we address this now, let's all be friends, you know. But yeah, process. Sorry, yeah. Oh wait, I think there's one here.
From Priyanka and Mario, and then
Who goes? Okay. Thank you for your presentation, NayanTara. Normally, Pratik and I sort of pre-align to stay quiet most of the 3 days, but really, your presentation has been very strangely rooted to our sort of way of working or our vision. We always wanted to run a space or a program which is very rooted in dialogue making, rooted to thinking about some very focused ideas, and we've decided that we can't be sort of bound by ideas of where does funding come from, and then we decided to create our own funding by doing what we do, running the gallery that we do. But what I think we need to learn and further, you know, sort of see from case studies, if there's something like this worldwide, is what is the vision forward? What do you plan to do? Something so similar to ours, I would be very interested to know. What do you, there are two of you leading the program, right?
You mean imperfect solidarities or like?
Multiple people.
Multiple
so what is the
people,
collective vision?
Big question. We want to change the world.
Short term, like say 5-7 years.
Yeah. We have a long wish list. We do feel now, 12 years into this, we do feel the need for a space of some sort, but we are thinking of potentially cohabited spaces. So we do work closely with other organizations and collectives in the city, and so there are 3 other groups that we've been in conversation with for the last several years. But I would say that's sort of this this sort of dream thing. But it's something we always push to the back somehow, because I think what excites us and what like keeps us going are sort of these kinds of like um, knowledge creation, projects of really like intersecting with. We work. So we exist as two entities legally. One is a NGO, because that allows for us to do grant making work, and one is a private limited company that allows us to sell services. So we sell services in terms of all sorts. We're like consultants for various things. We design exhibitions and outputs of various sorts recently, but we also work very closely with small NGOs also, really like working with them to build campaign strategies, build means to communicate about their work, to tell their stories to a larger audience, and to do some of this advocacy work as well. We want to really continue to do that. The archive is growing. We want to try to like create better resources for the archive. The archive really is, I mean, it's a visual archive, but it is really one of the only sort of non-state repositories in a sense, and so we would love to collaborate and get on Padma. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of an endless list really of what we'd like to do. The festival will keep going for as long as it makes sense. We do think sometimes about, I mean, it's such a production, right? I mean, all of you know here, like putting these things together. And sometimes we really wonder, like the amount of energy it takes to fundraise for something like that. Like if we were to stretch that out and spread it out over 2 years, like, would we be doing more? And also really more sort of in depth, because sometimes it feels, the spectacle is all fun and great. But the slow building, we're really also happy to work quietly. I mean, we've been doing that for 12 years. Like, so yeah.
I just want to go back to the Feminist Memory Project and no, I just wanted to go back to the Feminist Memory Project because you've been working on it for such a long time. And one of the forms of like combating exclusion also is to think that the margins do not have documents, but actually there have been documents that have existed over time and that have been brought into the ambit of the project. Something that Divas has maintained, who's also your partner on this project, is the idea of how the Feminist Memory Project, in a way, also functions as evidence. Maybe perhaps you could talk a little more about moving away from iconology and just how giving it has been to probably work with the indexical and what that process has been like in this impulse of the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd like to say to that is that, as evidence, then what does one do with that evidence, right? And this whole idea of activating some of these repositories of indexes and evidence that we create, and with Shaina, your work too, it's like, what are the possibilities, but also challenges around doing that? As an idea, it's great and possible, but like to actually like take it from that idea and then to really open it up to university students or NGO projects and social justice projects and lawyers if they want to come work with it, and journalists and researchers. I mean, one of the things earlier we were talking about was this, I mean, in art history work, right, and or in any kind of research, I suppose, one tends to sort of, go and dig deeper where there is already some kind of knowledge bank that exists, right? And so the secondary knowledge platform feels almost like without that, one cannot do research almost, right? Especially when the research is always happening sort of externally. So this is becoming somewhat of a repository for people to at least dig into. But there are so many challenges, like the annotation work, like you're having the human. I mean, one of the questions I had for you was like, who on earth sits there and, does all this work? And yeah, and so these are like realistic sort of challenges. But yeah, I don't know if I'm not necessarily responding to your question. But I think there was someone back there.
You want to answer? Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If anyone's interested, the video we could play it. It's a 4-minute video, and then all of you can leave when
We are concluding.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So as a viewer, it was such a refreshing and such a significant experience for a person who is in Kathmandu and knows that it's all of these different photographers from all around the world, all of these different artists and all of the discussions and discourses that take place within the context of Photo Kathmandu is a very rare thing. You feel, okay, this is a very special event, not just for artists but for almost everyone, because it does become like a important spectacle.
idea of the exhibition was to take it out in a public and not do in a closed space. Apart from that, whenever I am there, women and girls and men come up to me, especially women. Oh, this is something I've been through. This is exactly how my relationship is with my mother, or oh my God, I'm at a stage now where I'm expected to get married and I don't know if I want to oh, I have been in an abusive relationship, so things like that, and where maybe for me also was to reach out and for them that they're not alone and we're not alone, so we're all in it together, and to sort of have those conversations.
When you said to come and show, and I said then let's show for 6 months. Let's work in many ways around the work. Whether it's with professionals of various kinds or with students or with teachers, and let's find a way to work. And for that you need duration. I found this way of showing far more interesting and meaningful.
There might be some people who think maybe workshops are difficult because they're so short and brief. But when you come together as people and you're vulnerable together and you create this energy together that is open and exchanging and honest, that even in 4 days something absolutely incredible can come from that.
नेपाली समाजको जागृतिमा, नेपालमा लोकतन्त्र स्वतन्त्रताको स्थापनामा महिलाहरूले राणाकालदेखि, पञ्चायती कालदेखि, बहुदलीय कालदेखि माओवादी जनयुद्धसम्म खेलेको भूमिका उल्लेख्य रूपमा देखिएको छ। यदि कुनै इतिहास दृष्टि भएको मान्छेले, समाज दृष्टि भएको मान्छेले, भाषा भएको मान्छेले यति नै सामग्रीको आधारमा इतिहास लेख्ने हो भने जनताको खास्साको इतिहास भन्छ।
It's kind of difficult to actually wrap up the entire day. So if it's okay with everybody, I think this end note by NayanTara and the presentation as one big model also really also kind of thinking from where we started with the kind of institutional practice of something like APT to come to this also felt really important, because again we need to validate all kinds of models and all sorts of ways of reaching audiences, and together as a community we can and we do that. So that's all I feel like I need to say in terms of also what we do at the Hub.